Yeah.
Yeah. If they have this project, they say, and then France defense. Yeah, so I
Oh,
blindfolded.
there you come. However you want to do it. Feel lucky that they can fold.
All right, so welcome everyone to the April Iowa Nutrient Research Center seminar. Yes, we are unmuted. Hopefully you can see me. Hopefully you can hear me. It's great to be here today, and thanks for attending on what is a beautiful day here in Ames, although it's windy, I guess. So I haven't been outside for a long time. So some people could be doing something more, no, not more enjoyable, but could be doing something different on a beautiful day. This is going to be enjoyable. We are really fortunate to have to talk a little about the social science associated with conservation practices and nutrient reduction. Just about every meeting I go to, people talk about this, and I'm an ag engineer, so I can't respond to it. So say we need people like it, we need more, and that's why it's kind of sad to introduce our next speakers, Dr. Laurie Witzling and Dr. Dara Wald, because when they got the INRC funding, they were at Iowa State University, and now they have moved on. Dr. Witzling in Wisconsin and Dr. Wald in Texas. Which is sad for us here at Iowa State University, but we really appreciate the work that they've done on this and other projects, but certainly from INRC work. So those of you in the room, hopefully you got the little thing. We'll have a raffle for the coffee mug. For those online, come next time and you can be in on that. And just a reminder, next month we have Allison Robertson and Erica Lundy talking a bit about a cover crop. So that's going to be May 10th. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Witzling and Dr. Wald.
Hello, can you all hear me all right?
Yep, can hear you well.
Great, thank you for having us here today, and thank you for the funding to do this project. I'm going to be presenting for Dara and I, and in just a second, I'll mention the many other collaborators who worked with us on this project. It was called Increasing Farmer Engagement with Conservation Practices Through More Effective Communication Strategies. We got this funding in 2019, which means we did have to change course a little bit because then the pandemic happened. So Dara and I were with the Greenlee School at Iowa State when this project started, so shout out to them. And we had many other partners with this work, the Iowa Learning Farms, Jackie Comito, and staff there, Liz Ripley and Nathan Stevenson. We worked with grad students on this project. Nora at ISU Extension administered the survey, and we had our social media consultant, Brett, at UW-Madison. So a really wonderfully interdisciplinary team, which made this a really fun project to do. So before I dive into the actual work we did, I just want to give that 3,000-foot view of why do we care about communication research. And for us, our objectives, why we did this, one, because there was some real practical value. There are so many groups, public and private, that conduct outreach related to conservation. So we wanted to be able to offer some really practical strategies. And two, we can also connect outreach to behavior change. So in this case, adopting conservation practices. And there are different theories you could think about to make that connection. Two that you might have heard of: diffusion of innovations and theory of planned behavior. So with diffusion, the big idea is if someone is ready to make a change and your outreach reaches them, they can run with it, and then they are going to tell their peers about it, and that peer-to-peer communication is going to be disproportionately more influential. And another theory you might think about is theory of planned behavior, which could be related to outreach and behavior change, in that the theory of planned behavior talks about how there are these different factors that come before behavior change. Most of them have sort of strange, complicated names, except for attitudes. So I'll use that as an example. So if your outreach can change, attitudes. In turn, attitudes might impact an intention to change a behavior, which then leads to behavior change. And if you're looking for some examples of research that connects information and behavior in this context, we just wanted to offer this citation. There's lots of studies mentioned in that piece. So on our project, we had 4 main parts, and I'm going to talk about highlights from each of them in this presentation, but I am just going to focus on highlights since we don't have a lot of time, and I will point you toward places where you can get more information about each one. So we started with a review of previous studies where farmers were surveyed, and it involved conservation and communication. We knew we wanted to do a survey like that, and we wanted to think about, well, where are the gaps? And as we started looking at previous literature, we realized, okay, that could potentially be a standalone publication because there's a lot to be said there. And then that led into the second piece, which was the survey that we did. We surveyed farmers who participated in Iowa Learning Farms events, and we used some of the lessons learned from that first part in our survey. And as I mentioned, this happened during the pandemic. So that survey also became an opportunity to look at virtual outreach because Iowa Learning Farms really kicked into gear with their webinars and virtual field days. Then we wanted to do a social media test and look at how messages performed on social media. It was something we learned in that review of survey studies that not a lot of research had focused on social media. And lastly, we did do a content analysis of the way conservation is talked about in the news in Iowa, because we wanted to learn more about how agricultural and urban audiences might be seeing things differently, and also, whether or not those publications were quoting different sources. Okay, so that review of previous survey studies, if this is interesting to you, it is published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. We did a search for published articles between 2009 and 2019. These were studies that surveyed farmers in the US about conservation, and they had at least one variable in their study related to communication. So we found almost 50 studies to review. Some highlights here: when the studies we looked at included more than one information source in their survey instrument, there was evidence that farmers are using multiple sources of information, and also that farmers have some distinct preferences, including that some prefer traditional outreach and others prefer digital outreach, which is something we ended up exploring in our survey. But we also saw many examples of information or communication just not really being included in a very dynamic way in surveys. So we offered some recommendations in this piece going forward about how we might think more broadly about those kinds of variables. And this chart on the left shows what sources have been included in previous studies. So you can see this is extension. Almost 60% of the studies we looked at included some variable related to extension, such as, did you get information about conservation from extension? And the ones that have not been asked about very much are over here, right? So media, did you hear about this in the news? Did you hear about this on social media? Many fewer studies included those kinds of variables. So there's just less that we can say in general about the impact of those kinds of sources because they're less studied. We were also curious about segments of farmers. So when you're thinking about communication strategy, you could have one main audience, a mass audience that have the same message for everyone. If you had lots of resources, you could communicate individually with everyone. That would be very intensive though, or you could aim somewhere in the middle. And I'm not sure what's going on. This demographics is supposed to have a different color here. So both demographics and behavior represent this idea of segments, that maybe you're tailoring your message based on location or by age group. Or with behavior, maybe you have messages that are different for someone who's adopted a conservation practice versus someone who hasn't. Or in our case, what we ended up doing was looking at people who seek out outreach opportunities online versus in person. So we didn't see a lot of evidence in the literature that that kind of analysis had been done. So that was a cue to us that there was work to be done there, and we wanted to take that on. Oh, there we go. There's there's demographics in green. Okay, so the second thing we did was a survey of farmers and landowners in Iowa. And the survey went to people who'd come to an Iowa Learning Farms event, either in person or online. And as I mentioned, this went out during the pandemic. Here's who participated. On average, about 650 acres, average age 63, and predominantly male and white. So as far as segmentation goes, we were limited, I think, in terms of doing a study based on demographics, but we did see a real diversity in how people sought out outreach opportunities. So we put people into the following categories: people that participated only in a virtual Iowa Learning Farms event, so a webinar or a virtual field day, people who did something online or in person. F2F stands for face-to-face. So this group would have come to an Iowa Learning Farms event in person recently. And then this inactive group has come to an in-person event, but not for several years. And so when we looked at the data this way, we saw that actually we do see a trend for average age going down with those virtual options and greater proportions of women participating in those options. So just in terms of increasing a diversity of people coming to these things, that those virtual events are important, but the face-to-face events also remain important. People who went to those expressed a preference to continue doing that. We asked some questions on the survey about how people communicate or look for information. Here's some examples of the survey variables. I share my views about water quality. I share information about water quality. I ask farmers questions about water quality. And what we saw was that virtual flexible group, the people who come to events in person and online, they just seem to be very active communicators. They're looking for information and they're sharing information. So that was exciting to identify them as that kind of group. And because they are coming to both the virtual events and the in-person events, they can be a go-between. So to whatever degree there are views or resources shared at one kind of event or the other, these are people who are able to pass that content back and forth. We also asked some really specific questions about media sources, and we saw that the people who come to the virtual events were more likely to use some of these online resources, social media, podcasts, YouTube, to get information about agriculture. And then again, the virtual flexible group just came out really high on a lot of these items. We continue to get the idea that they are these people that are just really seeking out a lot of information. And before I move on to talking about social media, I'll mention that these results are going to be published in the Journal of Extension, I am told probably later this month. So this article is called Virtually the Same, so it should be up on their website soon. So we wanted to do a social media test. We wanted to think about what themes would perform the best to come up with some really practical recommendations. And we were also still thinking about age and gender, because with that survey, we didn't see a huge diversity in terms of those demographics. But with social media, we thought, well, maybe we could learn something there. And we did confirm from those survey results that social media is maybe not the most popular way people are learning about agriculture, but it is used. So a quick note about Facebook: if you have a page as an organization and you post something, not everybody who follows your page is going to see it. That's private information that Facebook uses to decide that. One estimate is maybe 1 in 19 people who follow you. You can pay Facebook to show it to more people. That's a boost. And you can also create ads. And that's what we did in our study. With ads, you just have more choices about placement and targeting tools. So we had 4 different themes, and we advertised a number of different events. And I'll just show you really quickly on the back end what this looks like. You can tell Facebook how much you want to spend. So we spent $20 a day on the ads. You tell Facebook how long the ads should run, where they should appear. So the Facebook newsfeed, and I'll just mention Instagram uses the same back end. So we could have done Instagram, but we didn't. You can pick some targeting variables about your audience. So age, we did all adults. In my screen grab, this says US, but we focused on Iowa for most of our studies. Then you can upload your media and your text. You can pick a call to action. And then you get your ads. So I'll show you a couple examples. So we picked 4 themes that are rooted in these ideas of farmer identity and farmer identity literature. Business was one, that's this one here. Science, this is stewardship, and this is farmers as heroes. So what we did is we wanted to promote an event with these 4 themes. They were running simultaneously, and we tried to keep as much as the same we could in each ad to reduce the noise, but then to change keywords and images in a way to make those themes pop. So here's another example for a different event. Here's the science theme, the business theme, and here's that call to action. I mentioned learn more, so that's what people would click on. The hero theme and the stewardship theme. So which works the best? It really depends on what you want. So the business theme was the most cost effective, meaning, run with that if you just care about clicks. But the thing that's tricky about Facebook is that what determines how much something costs is based on more than one thing. So impressions, like how many times Facebook has to show an ad to someone, changes the cost. So if your ad is really bad and to get 100 clicks, you need 10,000 people to see it. That's more expensive than if your ad is great and everyone who sees it wants to click on it. So Facebook only has to show it to 100 people to get 100 clicks. But Facebook also charges different amounts to different people. So how much it costs to advertise in my newsfeed might be different than in Dara's newsfeed. And how they determine what costs what is part of their algorithm that is proprietary. So what we saw was that for women and younger people, we actually had more engagement with the science and steward themes or frames. So in terms of, clicks, shares, comments, the number of women who saw the science and steward frames engaged more with those frames versus the business frames. So if you're interested in diversifying your audience, these frames might be better. But if you're just interested in, getting clicks, getting eyeballs on your page, the business theme would be better. Okay, last study, I'm just going to mention quickly about this one. We were curious about whether or not nutrient reduction was being talked about differently in different news outlets. And we'd actually started more broadly with looking at things like water quality and conservation, but there was a lot of noise when we were retrieving articles. So we looked at 2 ag-focused news outlets, the Spokesman and Iowa Farmer Today, and 2 that were targeting urban audiences or more general audiences. We looked at the Des Moines Register and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. We examined almost 500 articles over 10 years, and then we coded them for looking at key themes and who was used as a source in quotes in those articles. And we wanted to do this both to see if there were sort of the same trends among all of them and whether or not people were getting the same story, since ag and non-ag audiences are all stakeholders in nutrient reduction. So a few things we found. Agriculture was the most common theme that these stories were being, the first theme to show up in the stories, either in the headline or the lead. And as far as quotes go, we did see that one of the ag papers quoted ag representatives more often. The second most common theme was the environment, and one of those urban news outlets quoted environmental groups more often. So as far as getting the same story goes, even though both those themes were really common, if those news outlets are quoting different people, I think it's safe to say that the readers are seeing some different content. And then we also found that science and health themes were just generally a lot less frequently used. So there's potentially a missed opportunity there. A few overall conclusions. We know that farmers are using lots of types of media, traditional and digital. We're seeing some preferences for that. We see this evidence of this really active communication group, those virtual flexible farmers. We know that age and gender can impact both which outreach preferences those farmers have, with younger audiences being slightly more attracted to the virtual options. And we also know that from our social media study, the messages that resonate with those groups can be different. we also saw that evidence, at least with those papers, that media outlets can be emphasizing different conservation messages. So a next step, Dara is working with the student to go back into that survey data. There's also some content about behavior and edge of field practices to think about, well, can we draw some connections between background characteristics or demographics, the communication sources folks are using, attitudes, and I'm not sure if you can hear my dog, she just lost her patience, and behavioral intention. So with that, I just want to thank INRC again and Iowa Learning Farms, and also share these links. These are two of the papers you can get now, and this is a link to where that Journal of Extension paper should be posted soon.
All right, thank you, Laura. Dara, are you sharing information too, or just here to help answer questions?
I'm just here to help answer questions. Laura Laura did great.
Okay, no, great, thank you. All right, I think while I transition to get get Laurie Nowatzke's presentation up, maybe we take a question first. Anybody in the audience? In-person audience, I should have said. Yeah.
Is there any linkage between these different ways of communication and actual adoption of these conservation practices?
Laura, were you able to hear that?
I was, and also I just noticed Dara sent me a note that said none of my images showed up.
It was just the first one. All the rest of them did. It was just the first one.
Only the first one, yes.
Only the first one.
I think, Dara, I was watching the same thing, and I think if like the second or third hadn't have showed up, I would have been like, okay, let's just stop a second. But okay.
Yeah, connections between communication and behavior change. That's a great question. So Dara is going to be examining, making a model to look at those connections. It's not actual behavior change. It would be, it reported intention on a survey, but other research does show that generally when you say you intend to do something on a survey, there is a correlation between actually following through with it, although it's not 100%. Dara, do you have other thoughts about that one?
Yeah, I mean, most of the work that we did will show a correlation rather than a causation. So whether we're able to then say this message leads to behavior, the next step would be to do experiments, right? And we didn't do experiments. We didn't have the plan to do that, with the exception of the Facebook messaging, right, which is the closest we got to. And so to answer that question, we would need to do some experiments, and it's very difficult to do that with practical sort of place-based behavior, right? Like on a farm. These are things that we're like to do. I'd certainly like to do. The best we will get is out of our surveys to look at associations between the kinds of communication platforms and sources that people trust and like, and whether or not they're actually doing the kinds of conservation practices that like edge of field practices that Laura talked about before. So that's what we'll know at the end of the survey analysis in terms of our modeling. But in terms of the causality between those two, we don't have an answer for that. And that is a challenge for social scientists broadly.
All right, thank you so much. And I think we'll just, so that we have time for questions at the end, we'll transition to see here. Dr. Laurie Nowatzke, that's now the coordinator of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, but did her PhD work in sociology here at Iowa State, and had a fun project looking at evaluating nutrient reduction project with some of the biophysical indicators.
Social and bio.
Social and bio.
Social, yeah.
I like to
Cover it
have
there.
them.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, all right. I think maybe that'll go off in a second.
Cool, thanks. All right, well, yeah, thanks Laura and Dara. That was really fascinating, exciting to hear about the outcomes of that project too. So I will also be talking about an INRC project that was awarded in 2019. Certainly I pulled in a lot of the social science aspects, but also we're aiming to integrate social science indicators and metrics with biophysical, and like landscape measures as well. So, oh, we good. Oh, that's good.
Okay.
So yeah, as Matt said, I am currently with the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, which is located here on campus at Iowa State, but it's at the USDA National Lab for Ag and Environment. But when we started this project, I was serving as measurement coordinator for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy here at Iowa State with the College of Ag and Extension. And I will explain a little bit more about the team for this project and kind of what brought this project about. But before that, I kind of want to start with some storytelling. So this should be familiar to most people here, I think. So in 2013, Iowa enacted the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy in response to hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. The nutrient reduction strategy relies primarily on voluntary approaches for agriculture, so encouraging conservation practice adoption among farmers. So that started officially in 2013, but there was a kind of a sub project. The INRC measurement project really ramped up in 2015. I came on board at the end of 2015 with Iowa State to kind of bolster that project and coordinate it. And what we really relied on tracking indicators within a number of domains. So of course, a big piece of this was tracking conservation practice adoption throughout the state and water quality changes in the state. But we also aimed to understand what was going on kind of the inputs and administrative side and the human dimension. So the examples of inputs that we've tracked while I was in that role, and the current measurement coordinator is working on, is tracking staff and people. So who's working on nutrient reduction related projects in the state, both in universities and agencies as well as industry. Funding, agency resources, and also from the human dimension side, we were looking at how partner organizations were developing in response to the nutrient reduction strategy, conducting surveys to understand farmer knowledge, attitudes, and behavior around nutrient reduction. And then also kind of as a note, we did incorporate quite a bit about point sources, so wastewater treatment facilities and similar municipalities and what they were doing as well. So what we found is, working through this project and developing this tracking is that we developed a pretty good sense of how to do that on the statewide level, or even kind of at these Huck 8 watersheds, a larger sub-regional level within the state. But it was really difficult to understand how these domains interacted with each other. So what we were really interested in understanding is how do increased funding or changes in kind of the human landscape, like attitudes and hearts and minds, can we show an effect on conservation practice adoption, in reality in Iowa, and in turn, can we document effects on water quality changes? At the statewide level, that was really difficult. So I think now we're about 10 years into the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. At the time this project really started getting conceptualized, we were 5 years in. So it was still fairly nascent at the time, and what am I getting at? So metrics like cover crop adoption in the state and others, I'll use cover crops as an example. I mean, if at the time we were looking at maybe up to 5% adoption on row crop acres, and it varied a little bit or quite a bit across the state, but even the more like hotspot areas in 2018 at the time were maybe up to 10%. And so what we found was that understanding these effects between kind of the human and social dimension and these biophysical metrics like practice adoption were getting really washed out. So it was hard to really identify at this scale where nutrient reduction progress was successful because the scale was working against us, because Iowa is a pretty vast when we're talking about these levels of numbers. So what we wanted to do was look at a smaller scale, kind of examine potentially where these hotspots might be and how can we demonstrate these interactions between the human dimension, the administrative aspects, and ultimate outcomes on the landscape. So we pulled together an interdisciplinary team. So working with some of the data team folks like Laurie Abendroth and Gio Chikladze, and some social folks, J.R. Buckle and Suraj Upadhyaya. We had Department of Statistics help, so Zheng Yuan Zhu and his student Zhoming, and help from Extension as well, and contractor working with the data, so Steph Bowden and Jamie Benning helping out with conceptualization. So really very interdisciplinary, understanding that we were going to be pulling a wide array of really disparate types of data. So we also knew we needed to identify smaller areas to examine, geographic areas. So we opted to kind of look at what was going on with watershed projects in the state. So for anyone who's not familiar, watershed projects tend to be, there are exceptions, but tend to be smaller geographic areas that where there's maybe a coordinator or other staff who are working with the community in that watershed project to distribute funding for conservation practices, encourage adoption, do kind of specialized outreach. And this map, it's out, I'm sure it's outdated, but as of 2018, this is kind of the extent and range of the types of watershed projects that were going on in Iowa at the time. And they all have kind of different timelines and goals, and some are focused on like E. coli issues, some are focused on working with very specific types of producers like seed corn producers. So we wanted to kind of focus in on a consistent group of watershed projects. So we decided to look at the Iowa Water Quality Initiative. So this program was developed in response to the nutrient reduction strategy, and it's administered by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. And this is the handful of projects we ended up analyzing. There are quite a few more, but what helped this project, looking at WQI projects, was that there was quite a bit of consistency in terms of their goals. They were working to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loads in those watersheds. And also some of them were really, the ones we looked at were really starting within a few years of each other. Also, we knew that there was relatively consistent administrative reporting. So we knew that we would have access to IDAL's quarterly and annual reports as well to kind of understand what was going on in those watershed projects. So, with this research question of, how do we understand the effects that administrative and human aspects have on practice adoption and ultimately water quality, we developed a kind of a general framework that's kind of inspired by that initial logic model, the inputs, human, land, and water figure that I showed you, but kind of digs into what kinds of variables that we want to look for. So, so we broke it out into administrative and outreach type metrics, social climate or kind of human internal cognition or behaviors or engagement as sort of our social piece, and then ultimately, wanting to understand what impact that those factors have on biophysical landscape changes, so practice adoption and changes in water quality. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the data sources we pulled in, but what I want you to take away is that each of these areas focused on kind of a different type of data source, and we examined many more data sources than we ended up using. It was a really big challenge to identify which ones would kind of work best with some of these metrics, because some maybe aren't as consistently collected or aren't fully publicly available, or maybe they're at the wrong spatial or temporal scale. So we ran into some challenges, but ultimately came out with a handful of data sources, maybe about 10, that can speak to each of these areas. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, since the font's kind of small here, and talk about how we examined the administrative factors and kind of the social climate. And then I'll go into a little more about what kinds of relationships we found. So administrative and outreach efforts that we looked at, the administrative factors primarily came from quarterly and annual reports that were submitted by the watershed project coordinators for these watershed project areas. So we had a contractor who really scoured a lot of text-based PDF data, which ended up being our biggest bottleneck when it came to gathering and collecting data. And I do want to add, one goal of this project was to determine if we could answer these questions without collecting additional new data. Watershed project coordinators do tend to be pretty maxed out in terms of their capacity. There's a lot of other research projects that are, looking to, interview watershed project coordinators, which is really important, but we wanted to kind of not put any burden on them for this project in particular, and see if, does the currently available public data allow us to get at some of these questions and evaluate progress in these watershed projects. So we were looking at administrative factors like engagement with partners, development of partnerships, how many organizations or what types of organizations they're developing partnerships with, what kind of leadership they have. So does the project coordinator or other staff seek out additional training or conduct talks with other organizations? What kind of project coordinator turnover is there? And how long has the watershed project been in operation? We also looked at outreach efforts from through other efforts with the NRS measurement project. We had gathered data on outreach that had been conducted throughout the state by a variety of organizations. So we identified where certain outreach events had happened either in or near these watershed projects we were looking at, what kind of attendance they had. We also looked at individual outreach and mass communications by the watershed coordinators. And then the social climate piece, we were utilizing a 5-year survey that was conducted with Iowa farmers about the nutrient reduction strategy specifically. So we were looking at aspects like attitudes and concern about nutrient reduction, their use of cost share and technical assistance, their engagement with watershed projects in their area, and also kind of other perceptions and influence from organizations that those farmers suggested they experience. So I'm going to go into a little bit of results. So part of what we did for this was, let me back up one moment and just share that we had initially wanted to conduct like a regression model or something in order to kind of get some statistical understanding of these relationships between these factors while considering holding other variables constant and stuff. But we only had 8 watershed projects to work with. We considered adding more, but our biggest bottleneck was gathering that administrative data and tabulating all of that information that's submitted quarterly by those reports. So we weren't able to gather enough data about these projects in the time and resources that we had in order to do kind of a more robust statistical analysis. But what we did instead was we wanted to look at, so we looked at bivariate or like 2 variable relationships instead. So we hypothesized a set of relationships that we expected. So for example, one of them was the idea that leadership and partnership building leads to increased outreach and engagement within the community. That's one example. Or increased event attendance at water quality related field days leads to or is associated with cover crop adoption in that area. So that's the kind of things we looked at. I'll share with you a couple that were significant relationships, many were not, but we did find some that really back up what we expected with our hypotheses. So this one suggests that administrative functioning, so like leadership and partnerships annually in a watershed project is positively correlated with event attendance in that watershed area or nearby. Similarly, administrative functioning like leadership and partnerships is statistically correlated with cover crop adoption as a percent of row crop areas, acres. But when you actually look at this chart, it's very it's variable, right? So whether that statistical significance is practical or not is a question. Functioning is, this should say bioreactors and saturated buffers here at the top, but administrative functioning is also, it suggests that it's a significant relationship with bioreactor and saturated buffer adoption. But again, the variability here is really, really high. We found that watershed group awareness, so farmers suggesting they're aware of a watershed group operating in their area, was correlated positively with bioreactor and saturated buffer adoption. This we expected simply because bioreactors and saturated buffers typically require funding from agencies or cost share, and so those who adopt these practices tend to be engaged in their with their local county offices or their watershed project nearby already. Similarly, watershed group awareness is possibly correlated with cover crop adoption as well. I should point out that each of these dots is a watershed project and a year within a watershed project. So for some general kind of takeaways, one thing we have demonstrated here is that to some extent, existing data on watershed project functioning and practice adoption can help to document the potential effects of these social factors on conservation practice adoption. But that's with a huge caveat. So there's a lot of limitations at this point with the data that are available publicly to do sort of a more robust evaluation of watershed projects in Iowa. So what we ran into was format of the data. So understanding administrative aspects of watershed projects required tabulation of many pages of quarterly and annual reports. Consistency of the data. So some watershed projects they put together really detailed, well done reports. Others may be more limited in their time to be able to do that. So we had really varying quality of the administrative data that we were working with. It also depends on evaluation goals. So, we suggest as part of this project, a recommendation to agencies or other entities that help operate watershed groups is to consider your evaluation goals and think about what kind of information you want to gather from your watershed project coordinators or other staff in an efficient manner that can help kind of understand how some of these effects are playing out between administrative functioning and like social aspects and the practice adoption. And just as a note, some project outcomes that are going to be coming out of this project really soon is we're publishing the database that came along with this. We're censoring some private data like from the survey and some of the cost share data that we worked with, but much of it will be available through ISU data share. And then we've also developed a visualization app that is where some of those charts came from. So kind of to be able to explore some of these bivariate relationships that we've looked at here. So, in the end, we've encountered a lot of challenges, but also have been able to sort of document some of these relationships that we anecdotally have expected from watershed projects, but it is bearing out in the data to some extent. So with that, I will put up my contact information and yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Laurie. There is a question online here. We'll get to that one first. So here we go.
Our cover crop, so our cover crop acres, only the acres cost shared by the watershed project or all cover crop acres in the watershed? So that's a good question. This was both the watershed project data as well as NRCS and IDAL's cost shared databases. So we had at the HUC 12 level, we had cover crop data through any cost share program, any state or federal cost share program, I guess.
So it was just the cost shared acres.
Just cost shared acres, yeah. Which of course there will be others that weren't cost shared as well.
And then I had a question on the one that was the bioreactor and saturated buffer. I'm taking my prerogative with there. actually, it was the one on this one, on the administrative function. Did you, are any of those watersheds where there's zero? Are any of those watersheds locations where you would not maybe there's less tile drainage, or they're in an area that you wouldn't likely site a bioreactor? Just thinking like the Turkey or the way in Northeast Iowa or Southwest Iowa are in areas that you probably wouldn't expect to be siting bioreactors anyway.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can't speak to whether these would be typical for bioreactor saturated buffer siting. However, we did do it as acres treated by bioreactors and saturated buffers as a % of drained acres. So we incorporated, we estimated that the drained acres, I think that was from the transforming drainage database. And so looking at acres of that practice as a percentage of total drained acres, kind of assuming that if there are drained acres, there may be opportunities for bioreactors.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Another question.
Yeah, very interesting. And a question that I have, and I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure, is kind of related. Did you have any control groups or control watersheds that were not in a watershed program, and look at see if there's any differences, in cover crops and saturated buffers, bioreactors?
We did not for this project. So we were only looking at the WQI projects. And part of that was because, knowing that the administrative piece would be such a big part of this, we knew we wouldn't have any kind of administrative or much social data for a control watershed. That said, there are, so you might be familiar with like Jackie Comito and Jamie Benning did a study where they compared formal watershed projects with other, so they did kind of that watershed pair with more qualitative data as well. And so there is other work that looks at it from that angle.
To clarify, the first plot of the Huckate watersheds, that was number of acres implementing nutrient reduction strategies, and that strategy was cover cropping. Or
So-
were you looking at multiple strategies?
So this map in particular, so this is part of the statewide tracking. And actually, I just noticed Rob is here. He's the current measurement coordinator for the nutrient reduction strategy. So this map was, this is acres of cover crops as of fall 2016. So certainly will have changed since then. So I think it's just absolute acres though, this one. So each Huckate watershed, how many acres are in that watershed for cover crops? Oh yeah, so this was one example, but there's a dashboard where you can view other practices as well. So if you're interested in that.
I'm totally interested.
Okay.
This plays into my work.
Okay, great.
Beautifully.
Talk to the
great.
gentleman behind you.
Yeah,
We
and
got a
Rob
good
is right
connection.
there.
We
Yeah.
go. Yeah. You can-
Yeah.
You can hear about the new ones coming out soon.
Yeah.
And all right. Oh, Catherine.
If
Yes.
there's time yet.
Yeah.
You said one of the variables was turnover, or was that included within administrative?
Turnover was a separate variable. So we did look at that. We, just due to like limitations, we did not run any like hypotheses with turnover, but we did document it and we'll have it in the database. But, one thing we found was that it's so widely varied. I mean, like some watershed projects of our 8 have had the same coordinator pretty much all 10 years or 8 years 5 years we looked at. Sorry, time scale I'm getting it. So WQI project started in about 2013, some a little later, and we looked at data through 2018. So some had one coordinator for that time, others had like 4. So it really depends. And so I think future work could look into that quite a bit.
But there
more.
wasn't any variables that like had a connection to turnover that was obvious, it sounds like.
We didn't actually look specifically at turnover so far with
Oh,
the
okay.
relationships we were looking at. So we've
Oh.
documented it, but we haven't
Oh, gotcha.
looked at
Okay.
it. It's related to other things. But yeah, I think someone should. Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to allow if we have any questions for Laura, Dr. Witzling or Dr. Wald as well, since we had to cut that one short in case there are any comments there. Or questions, not comments, questions.
Comments are welcome too.
Actually, if you can let us know, Laura, when that paper is published, because then we can make sure we get it posted Nutrient Research Center website and in our digital repository for folks to access. Okay, with that, it is pretty much 4 o'clock. Thank you. Let's give a virtual round of applause for those online and an in-person round of applause in the room. It's really important and useful work. Thank you all for all you've done to support INRC, and it's great to see you, Dara and Laura. And with that, I'll